On July 30th, 1975, one of the most influential men in the country disappeared without a trace. Because of his union leadership, many working Americans considered him their hero, but he also had powerful enemies. He is popularly believed to have been the victim of a Mafia hit, though conclusive evidence was never found, and his fate remains a mystery. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jolynn. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Jimmy's story. Jimmy Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. He was the third of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, born to John and Viola. In 1920, when Jimmy was just 7 years old, his father passed away from lung cancer. This was Jimmy's first look into unsafe working conditions, as his father had worked as a coal miner. His mother moved the family to Detroit in 1924, where Jimmy was raised and lived for the rest of his life. He dropped out of school at the age of 14 and began working full-time in manual labor jobs to help support his family. He began union organizational work at the grassroots level as a teenager while working for the grocery store Kroger, which paid substandard wages and offered poor working conditions. The workers were displeased with the situation and tried to organize a union to better their wages and working conditions. Although Jimmy was young, his courage and approachability impressed his coworkers, and he quickly rose to a leadership role. In 1932, after refusing to work for an abusive shift leader, Jimmy left Kroger. He was invited to become an organizer with the local 299 of the Teamsters Union organization. Between 1933 and 1935, Jimmy actively worked to recruit new members to the union. His favorite tactic was to pull up along the road along sleeping truck drivers, wake them up, and give them his sales pitch. Jimmy played a major role in the union's skillful use of strikes, boycotts, and other means of leveraging union strength at companies. He worked to defend the Teamsters from raids by other unions and extended the union's influence in the Midwest. The process took several years, but eventually it made the Teamsters one of the most powerful unions in the country. The Teamsters was founded in 1903. In 1933, when Jimmy joined their efforts, they had 75,000 members. As a result of Jimmy's work, he consolidated local union trucker groups into regional sections and then into a national body. Membership grew to 170,000 members by 1936, and 3 years later to 420,000. The number grew steadily during World War II to eventually grow to over 1 million members by 1951. Jimmy was deferred from military service in World War II after he successfully made a case for his union leadership skills being of more value to the nation by keeping freight running smoothly to assist the war effort. During one of his strikes in the beginning of 1936, Jimmy met Josephine, a Detroit laundry worker. He described the meeting as feeling as though he had been hit on the chest with a blackjack. On September 25, 1936, Jimmy and Josephine married in Bowling Green, Ohio. The couple had 2 children, a daughter, Barbara, and a son, James. In 1939, the Hoffas settled down in northwest Detroit, paying $6,800 for a modest home. The family would later own a summer lakefront cottage in Orion Township, north of Detroit. In December 1946, Jimmy became president of Local 299 when its former leader was imprisoned for bribery. He was praised for his tireless work to expand the union and his unwavering devotion to the organization's members. Jimmy continued to climb the ladder within Teamsters, first leading the combined group of Detroit area locals and later advancing to become the head of the Michigan Teamsters groups. He found himself widely popular among his fellow workers and the politicians and businessmen with whom he negotiated, but he also had a dark side. Unions during this time were heavily influenced by, and in many cases, controlled by elements of organized crime. Many Teamster leaders partnered with the Mafia to racketeer and embezzle money. Jimmy was no exception. To unify and expand unions, Jimmy made arrangements with many gangsters in the Detroit area, and organized crime's influence on the Teamsters increased as the union grew. Jimmy continued making relationships with high-ranking mobsters, and with it, his power within Teamsters grew. At the 1952 Teamsters Convention in Los Angeles, Jimmy was selected as National Vice President by incoming President Dave Beck. The presidential successor, Daniel Tobin, had been president since 1907, and Jimmy was vital in securing regional support for Beck's presidency. In exchange, Beck made Jimmy vice president. Following his election, Jimmy began spending more time away from his home in Detroit, dividing his time between the Teamsters headquarters in Washington, D.C., and traveling around the country for his expanded responsibilities. Jimmy took over the presidency of the Teamsters in 1957 at the convention in Miami Beach, Florida. His election followed the conviction of fraud of his predecessor, Dave Beck. Members of the union were becoming frustrated with Jimmy and accused him of corrupt leadership. At a later convention for a local union in 1957, union members voted nearly 5-1 to expel the Teamsters. The president of the local chapter gave an emotional speech advocating for the removal of Teamsters and stating he could only agree to further affiliate with the Teamsters if they dismissed Jimmy as their president. He demanded a response from Jimmy, and Jimmy responded through the press, simply saying, "We'll see." At the time, the Teamsters was bringing in over $750,000 annually from this local union. Their efforts were unsuccessful, and in 1961, Jimmy was re-elected as president. He continued his work to expand the union, and in 1964, he succeeded in bringing in all over-the-road truck drivers in North America under a single agreement. This is arguably his biggest achievement in a lifetime of union activity. Jimmy tried to bring airline workers and other transport employees into the union, but with limited success. His tenure became increasingly complicated by personal troubles as he was under investigation and later imprisoned in the 1960s. In 1957, he faced major criminal investigations as a result of the McClellan Committee, a committee created by the U.S. Senate to study the extent of criminal and other improper practices in the field of labor management. On March 14, 1957, Jimmy was arrested for allegedly trying to bribe an aide to the committee. He denied the charges and was later acquitted, but the arrest triggered additional investigations and more arrests. In May 1963, Jimmy was indicted for attempted bribery of a grand juror during his 1962 conspiracy trial. He was convicted on March 4, 1964, and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Later that year, he was convicted of 1 count of conspiracy and 3 counts of mail and wire fraud, stemming from misuse of Teamster pension funds. He received a 5-year sentence for these charges. Jimmy spent the next 3 years appealing the convictions, but his attempts were unsuccessful. In 1967, he began serving his combined total of 13 years in the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Despite having been convicted of jury tampering and mail fraud, Jimmy was once again re-elected without opposition to his third 5-year term as president of Teamsters at the union's Miami Beach Convention in 1966. Though aware of his legal situation, Frank Fitzsimmons was elected as vice president in preparation for him to take over as president if Jimmy were to serve jail time, which Jimmy would soon do. Jimmy was also planning for his conviction and intended to use Fitzsimmons as a figurehead through which he could maintain his control of the union. Fitzsimmons was loyal to Jimmy and owed his own high position in large part to Jimmy's influence. Despite this, Fitzsimmons quickly distanced himself from Jimmy after 1967. While still in prison, Jimmy resigned as Teamsters president on June 19, 1971. As a result of his resignation, Jimmy was awarded $1.75 million in termination benefit from the Teamsters Retirement and Family Protection Plan. This type of pension settlement had never occurred within the Teamsters before. On December 23, 1971, less than 5 years into his 13-year sentence, Jimmy received a presidential pardon from Richard Nixon. He regained his freedom, but as a condition of Nixon's pardon, Jimmy was to steer clear of union activity until March 6, 1980. something that Jimmy says he never agreed to. He had no intention of waiting that long and began exploring ways to regain his leadership. He accused senior Nixon administration figures, including the Attorney General and White House Special Counsel, of depriving him of his rights. In 1973, Jimmy filed a lawsuit in an attempt to invalidate the restriction so that he could reassert his power over the Teamsters. The court ruled that Nixon had acted within his powers, as it had been based on Jimmy's misconduct while he was serving as a Teamsters official. With much of his old influence lost, Jimmy accepted a non-management position with Local 299, likely hoping that within time he would be able to work his way back up the ladder. He also began working on an autobiography titled Hoffa, The Real Story. This would be published a few months after his disappearance. Earlier, he had published a book in 1970 called The Trials of Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy's plans to regain power over the Union were met with opposition from several members of the Mafia. One of them was Anthony Provenzano, who had been a Teamsters local leader in New Jersey and a national vice president of the Union during Jimmy's second term as its president. Anthony held a leadership role within the New York City Genovese crime family and was known for making his enemies disappear. At least 2 of his opponents in the Union had been murdered, and others who had spoken out against him had been assaulted. Anthony had once been an ally of Jimmy, but became an enemy after they reportedly had a feud when both were in prison at Lewisburg in the 1960s. In 1973, and again in 1974, Jimmy asked him for his support to regain his former position, but Anthony refused and reportedly threatened Jimmy by saying he would pull out his guts or kidnap his grandchildren. Anthony Giacalone, an alleged kingpin in the Detroit Mafia, and his younger brother Vito became involved in the conflict. The brothers made 3 visits to Jimmy's home and 1 visit to his business office in an attempt to set up a peace meeting between Jimmy and Provenzano. Jimmy's son James saw the visits for what they truly were. He said, "Dad was pushing so hard to get back in office, I was increasingly afraid that the mob would do something about it." James was convinced that the peace meeting was actually an attempt to set Jimmy up for a hit. It is said that Jimmy became increasingly uneasy each time the Giacalone brothers arrived. Jimmy eventually agreed to meet with Provenzano and Giacalone. It was at this meeting that Jimmy disappeared. On Wednesday, July 30th, 1975, Jimmy drove the roughly half-hour drive from his home to the Maucus Red Fox restaurant located in a Detroit suburb. He had a meeting scheduled to take place at 2 p.m. with mobsters Provenzano and Giacalone. Before heading to the restaurant, he stopped at the office of his close friend Louis Linto, a former president of Teamsters who now ran a limo service. The two had been enemies early in their careers, but eventually became friends. When Jimmy left for prison, Louis had become Jimmy's official appointment secretary and had arranged a dinner meeting between Jimmy and the Giacalone brothers on July 26th, in which they had informed him of the July 30th meeting. Louis was out to lunch when Jimmy stopped by, so Louis talked to some of the staff present and left a message for Louis before heading to the Red Fox. Sometime between 2:15 and 2:30 p.m., Jimmy called his wife from a payphone located directly behind the restaurant. He complained that Giacalone had not shown up. His wife told him that she hadn't heard from anyone. He then told her that he would be home by 4 p.m. to grill steaks for dinner. Several witnesses saw Jimmy standing by his car and pacing the restaurant's parking lot. 2 men even recognized Jimmy and stopped to chat with him briefly. Jimmy made a call to Louis in which again he complained that the men were late and he thought he was being stood up. Louis told authorities Jimmy called him at 3:30 p.m., but the FBI suspected that the call must have been earlier based on the timing of other calls from Louis's office around that time. The FBI estimated that Jimmy left the location without a struggle around 2:45 p.m. One witness reported seeing Jimmy in the back of a maroon car, either a Lincoln or a Mercury, with 3 other people. At 7 a.m. on the next day, Jimmy's wife called her son and daughter to inform them that their father had not come home. At 7:20 a.m., Lewis went to the Red Fox and found Jimmy's car unlocked in the parking lot, but there was no sign of Jimmy nor any indication of what happened to him. Lewis called the police, and at 6 p.m., Jimmy's son filed a missing persons report. The primary piece of evidence was a maroon 1975 Mercury, which belonged to Coloni's son, Joseph. The car had been borrowed earlier that day by Jimmy's foster son, Chucky O'Brien. Chucky and Jimmy's relationship had soured in the years preceding Jimmy's disappearance, and investigators and Jimmy's own family suspected that Chucky had something to do with Jimmy's disappearance. On August 21st, police dogs identified Jimmy's scent in the car. Later, the FBI was able to match DNA from Jimmy's hair with a strand of hair found in Joseph's car, but it is possible Jimmy traveled in the car on a different day. Coloni and Provenzano denied having scheduled a meeting with Jimmy for July 30th. In fact, they weren't even near the restaurant that afternoon. Provenzano was seen fraternizing with local union members in Hoboken, New Jersey. He also told investigators that he was playing cards with Stephen Andretta in Union City, New Jersey that day. Stephen is the brother of Thomas Andretta, who would later be a person of interest in Jimmy's disappearance. In October 1975, authorities received a tip from an informant who said some members of the Mafia wanted Jimmy's body found, so they provided the location of his remains. However, when authorities searched the area, which was in Waterfound Township, Michigan, no remains were found. On December 4th, 1975, a federal investigator testified in court that a witness had identified 3 New Jersey men as having participated in the abduction and murder of Jimmy. The 3 men who were close associates of Provenzano were Thomas Andretta, Salvatore Briguglio, and his brother Gabriel Briguglio. The FBI set up extensive surveillance and even bugged conversations between Mafia members, but found they were unwilling to talk about Jimmy's disappearance. Despite the efforts of numerous law enforcement agencies, the investigation was leading to dead ends. Though years later, the FBI agent in charge of the FBI's Detroit office told the Detroit News that he knew who did it, but it would be impossible to prosecute anyone as the identities of their informants would have to be revealed as a result. The truth of what the FBI knew was revealed on June 16, 2006, when they released a 56-page report. In it, the FBI discussed the belief that Jimmy was murdered at the request of organized crime figures who regarded his efforts to regain power in the Teamsters as a threat to their control of the union's pension fund. The FBI came to this conclusion based on the evidence that Chucky, who was described by the FBI as a habitual liar, was driving Joseph Coloni's car on the day that Jimmy disappeared, and multiple witnesses placed Jimmy inside that car. His scent was picked up by police dogs, and a strand of his hair was recovered from the back seat. Officials located a shotgun from the trunk of the car, as well as numerous bullets in the glove compartment. The FBI noted that Provenzano was not senior enough to order a Mafia hit, so they assumed his only role in the case was to act as a lure to get Jimmy away from the restaurant and to the place where he would ultimately be killed. The Michigan State's former chief investigator disagreed with the FBI's findings, stating that he doubted that Jimmy could have seriously threatened the Mafia, as any information he had on the Mafia would also incriminate him. He suggested that the killing was accidental and that the men who were sent to meet with Jimmy were only meant to be low-level messengers. He argued that Jimmy had no realistic prospects for a comeback and that his disappearance did not share the usual characteristics of a Mafia hit. His theory did not gain wide acceptance. Arthur Sloan wrote in his 1991 book titled Hoffa that the most common theory of FBI investigators is that Russell Buffalino was the mob boss who ordered the murder, and that the Briguglio brothers, along with Thomas Andretta and Chucky O'Brien, were used to lure Jimmy away from the restaurant. The location of the murder is unknown, but over the years rumors have swirled and false tips have been called in. Charles Brandt wrote in his book titled I Heard You Paint Houses that Frank Sheeran, an alleged professional killer for the mob and a longtime friend of Jimmy, confessed to killing him. According to the book, Sheeran claims Chucky drove him, Jimmy, and fellow mobster Sal Briguglio to a house in Detroit belonging to an elderly widow who was lured out of her house. Sheeran claims he shot Jimmy dead at that house and that his body was taken to a crematorium in another state. Authorities found blood in the house where Sheeran said he shot Jimmy, but it did not belong to Jimmy, and the police quickly discredited his claims. In a jailhouse confession given by Richard Kuklinski, he claimed he was part of a 4-man team responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Jimmy. Former FBI agent Robert Garrity, who worked on Jimmy's case, dismissed these claims as a hoax, and other authorities have also stated that his involvement in Jimmy's disappearance is unlikely. A professor of criminology and criminal justice at Northern Arizona University suggested that it was likely that Jimmy was murdered a mile from the restaurant in the house of Carlo Licata, the son of mobster Nick Licata. As for the location of Jimmy's body, that also remains a mystery. It has been theorized that a waste incinerator in Jersey City and 2 in Detroit were possible locations, as well as a crematorium in the Detroit area. The FBI stated if the Detroit crime family was involved in Jimmy's disappearance, it is unknown why his body would be transported to New Jersey when the Detroit organized crime people had proven time and time again that they were capable of making people disappear on their own. Jimmy's body was rumored to be buried in the Giant Stadium, and in a 2004 episode show of The Mythbusters, the stadium was scanned with a ground-penetrating radar, and no trace of human remains was found. Additionally, no human remains were found when the Giant Stadium was demolished in 2010. In 2006, authorities received a tip from a federal detainee, Donovan Wells, leading them to a horse farm owned by Roland McMaster, an official for the Teamsters at the time when Jimmy disappeared. Wells told the FBI that when he lived on McMaster's farm, he witnessed seeing a number of cars on the farm. McMaster denied any involvement in Jimmy's murder and stated he was away on union business in Indiana at the time. The FBI spent 2 weeks and $250,000 searching the property, but found nothing of substance. In 2012, police officers took samples from the ground under a driveway in Detroit after a person reported having witnessed the burial of a body there around the time Jimmy disappeared. No evidence of human remains was found. In 2013, gangster Tony Zarelli implied that Jimmy was originally buried in a shallow grave, with plans to move his remains, but the plans were later abandoned and his remains lay in a field in northern Oakland County, Michigan, not far from the restaurant where he was last seen. On June 17, 2013, while investigating the information provided from Zarelli, the FBI was led to a property in Oakland Township, which was owned by Detroit mob boss Jack Taco. Authorities searched for 3 days but found no human remains. In a 2018 interview, former Columbia crime family mobster Michael Franzese makes the claim that he is in possession of a recorded tape that spells out everything and that he might release it at a later date. He stated that Jimmy's body is wet and it's somewhere deep. Again, in April of 2019, he stated he was certain that Jimmy's disappearance had been mob-related. He said he was aware of the location of Jimmy's body and of the identity of his shooter, and that he had tapes that revealed the details of this disappearance. When pressed for information on the whereabouts of Jimmy's remains, Franzese said, "I can tell you that it's wet, that's for sure." When speaking on the identity of Jimmy's shooter, he said, "Upon good information, I think I know who the real shooter is." He added that the shooter was alive and was serving time in prison. In a deathbed statement, a landfill worker claimed to have buried Jimmy's body in a steel drum 15 feet below the surface in a landfill in Jersey City, New Jersey. In October 2021, the FBI obtained a warrant and completed a site survey of the landfill, but found nothing. Thomas Andretta and his brother Stephen were named by the FBI as suspects. Both have since passed away. Digs are still periodically conducted in the Detroit area in search of Jimmy's body. It is widely believed he was murdered by members of the Mafia and that his body was cremated. He was declared legally dead in 1982, but the circumstances of his disappearance remain a mystery. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Jimmy's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and follow Without a Trace on social media. And join me next week as I dive into another case.